Chapter 921. The voice that had rung out in Tang Wulin's mind belonged to the beautiful silk tulip, and Tang Wulin was very astonished to hear this. 1 square kilometer was 1 million square meters. There were several hundred demonic sandbugs here, and if they could reduce 1 square kilometer of forest into desert in a day, then they were definitely some of the worst offenders contributing to destroying the ecosystem. In fact, they were almost as abhorrent as humans in this respect. With the beautiful silk tulip's explanation, Tang Wulin didn't say anything else. He stepped forward and stomped heavily down onto the ground, propelling his body directly toward the leader of the demonic sandbugs like a speeding arrow. The gigantic demonic sandbug let loose a strange cry and flapped its wings to counteract the increased gravitational force that had instantly spread toward it. At the same time, it stabbed its sharp front limbs toward Tang Wulin and released a plume of dark green mist as it flapped its wings. All of the other demonic sandbugs also began to flap their wings to release a vast expanse of dense dark green mist. This is a paralyzing mist. It doesn't inflict much damage to the target's body, but it has very powerful paralysis effects, and even direct contact with skin alone could quickly knock out a living being. This is something that demonic sandbugs regularly use to great effect, but in my presence, all poisons and toxins are ineffective. The beautiful silk tulip said in a proud manner. A layer of pink light had already begun to spread from Tang Wulin's body during its explanation, and the dark green mist was instantly dissolved upon coming into contact with the pink light. When the pink light came into contact with the huge demonic sandbug, it suddenly let loose a distressed screech and immediately tried to flee the scene. At the same time, its aura had been severely debilitated. Tang Wulin wouldn't be fit to be the leader of the current generation of Shrek's 7 monsters if he were to miss out on an opportunity like this. His golden dragon spear came crashing down with mountainous force, and the 10,000-year-old demonic sandbug's body was instantly shattered into countless pieces by his devastating attack. With the enhancements of his dragon moon battle armor, his strength definitely exceeded 200 tons. Even a titled Douluo wouldn't dare to take a direct attack from him without releasing their suit of battle armor. After destroying the leader of the demonic sandbug with one strike, Tang Wulin unleashed his ghost shadow perplexing track and swung his golden dragon spear, killing one demonic sandbug after another in a completely unstoppable manner. No demonic sandbug was able to last more than an instant against him, and one body after another exploded in the desert. Seeing as they were pests, there was naturally no need for him to hold back. The poisonous mist being emitted by the demonic sandbugs were completely ineffective in the face of the beautiful silk tulip, yet the beautiful silk tulip could inflict backlash onto these demonic sandbugs. Tang Wulin flapped his massive golden wings, and in conjunction with his ghost shadow perplexing track, his body transformed into a golden streak of light that whizzed over the desert sand. When these demonic sandbugs finally began to flee, less than half of their original numbers remained, and Tang Wulin was urged to hunt them down by the beautiful silk tulip. He was extremely fast, and even though he wasn't adept at unleashing long-distance attacks, he was still able to kill several dozen more of these demonic sandbugs. If it weren't for the fact that he was worried about Yuna, who was sitting in the car alone, he would have been able to chase down even more of these pests. After returning to the Tang sect battle vehicle, a series of soul rings had already risen up from the bodies of the dead demonic sandbugs, and they were very eye-catching in the night. Everything's all right now. Yue. Tang Wulin opened the car door before getting into the vehicle. However, Yuna was in a rather sour mood. They already ran away. Why did you continue to hunt them down? Tang Wulin replied with a smile. They're pests, so it's only right for me to hunt down as many of them as possible. Yuna lowered her head slightly and murmured, "Are all soul beasts pests in the eyes of humans?" Of course not. Tang Wulin chuckled. However, it's true that the vast majority of soul beasts are aggressive toward humans. He failed to notice the subtle changes in Yue's expression as he asked internally, "Senior Tulip, you've been living in the Icefire Yin Yang Wei your entire life. How do you know about the abilities of these desert soul beasts?" The beautiful silk tulip answered his question with a question of his own. What do you think is the scope covered by nature? Tang Wulin faltered slightly upon hearing this. It has to be an extremely massive scope, right? The beautiful silk tulip replied, "It's not that simple. In the beginning, there were only life forms of the lowest level in nature. After that, plants like us gradually began to appear. In terms of combat prowess, a plant system soul beast would definitely be inferior to a normal soul beast of the same level. We don't have the agile bodies that normal soul beasts possess, and our innate abilities are also far inferior in comparison. As the son of nature, I'm sure that you've already sensed that when you're situated within a forest or any other place with a vast amount of plant life, those plants can assist your spiritual power to sense things in the larger area. I am a monarch of the world of plants, and also a spirit plant myself. I can also gain an understanding of the outside world through plants. As such, I can learn about the outside world through word of mouth from other plants. Back when we'd signed a contract with the Tang sect, we'd already been made aware of just how terrifying the human world was. We just weren't aware of the exact scope of things. Many plants have brought information to me about these demonic sandbugs, informing me of how damaging they are to nature, and only then did I learn all of this information about them. If we'd faced another type of soul beast, I most likely wouldn't know anywhere near as much about them. Of course, plant system soul beasts are an exception to this. Tang Wulin was enlightened by this explanation. I see. It's a good thing that you informed me. The beautiful silk tulip smiled and said, "You've done a great service to nature by killing so many demonic sandbugs today. My lord, it's a pity that we can't leave the seat of nature as we please. Otherwise, we really wanted to help you hunt down all of those demonic sandbugs." Tang Wulin replied, "If I ever get the opportunity in the future, I'll be sure to travel around the outskirts of the desert to hunt down these pests." After his conversation with the beautiful silk tulip, Tang Wulin discovered that Yuna had already fallen asleep in the car. He adjusted her blanket before lying down by her side and encircling his arms around her body. Power always evoked awe and veneration within others. At night, no other desert soul beasts dared to attack them. The next day, they continued in their journey and finally arrived at the scorching basin at around noon. The place really lived up to its name as the air temperature was very high. As soon as they entered the basin, they had no choice but to change into some summer clothes. The roads in the basin were quite primitive and rugged, and the basin itself was like a massive city. Even though this place wasn't known as a city, it was the most populous place in the entire western region of the continent. Most of the buildings here were constructed from stone and clay, and the attire worn by the people here was completely different from the clothing worn by those on the other side of the desert. Many of them wore veils that shielded them from the wind and dust, so their facial features were completely obscured. Tang Wulin found a discreet place to stow his Tang sect battle vehicle, then entered the basin with Yue's hand in his. He wasn't planning to take Yue to the sky and mountain ranges. He'd heard that the conditions there were very harsh, and that it wasn't habitable to normal people. However, the scorching basin was different. There were many locals who lived here all year round, and at the same time, this was the most important trade city on the entire western region of the continent, so all types of day-to-day necessities could be found here. Yue, I'm going to join the military now. Can you live here on your own? I'll try to visit you as regularly as I can, Tang Wulin said in a gentle voice. Yuna faltered slightly upon hearing this. How long will you be away? A wry smile appeared on Tang Wulin's face. I'm not sure at the moment. That'll depend on the situation over there, but once I join the military, it most likely won't be easy for me to leave. I'll do my best to come back and see you as regularly as possible. No, I'm going with you, Yuna immediately said in a stubborn manner. Chapter 922. Tang Wulin heaved a resigned sigh. I can't take you with me in your current condition. I heard from the Vice Palace Master that the army on the Sky and Mountain Ranges is the most mysterious and also the strictest army on the entire continent. I'm worried that you'll be in danger if I take you there. You stay here for now, and if I find a place that is suitable for you to live it over there, I'll come back and take you there, all right? After spending so many days with Yuna, she had developed basic skills that would allow her to survive. The only issue was that she was far too beautiful, and that was a constant source of concern for Tang Wulin. In order to counteract this problem, he bought some tools along the way and made her a mask. The mask would conceal her stunning beauty, and after dyeing her hair black, she wouldn't be anywhere near as eye-catching as she currently was. Yuna lowered her head. She would always do this whenever she was unhappy about something, and Tang Wulin would always succumb to this trick. This was the best way that Yuna had devised to get what she wanted from Tang Wulin. Be a good girl now. I really can't take you with me this time. Do you smell that? It smells like roast meat. Tang Wulin's eyes suddenly lit up as he gently nudged through Yuna's arm. Where? As expected, the little foodie that she was immediately raised her head with an excited look on her face. She had been extremely displeased with the dried rations that they'd been eating in the desert for the past few days. Soon, they found a very traditional rotisserie in the scorching basin. Roast meat was sold in large chunks here, and the food was extremely appetizing, especially when paired with the fruit wine that was brewed by the locals. The meat here was roasted with great skill, resulting in a crispy exterior around a soft interior. Not only was the meat extremely delicious, the juices of the meat had also been sealed to perfection. Both Tang Wuling and Yuna were extremely satisfied with this meal. Tang Wuling no longer required large amounts of food to support his bloodline power, but having been a seasoned foodie for so many years, his digestive abilities were still very astonishing. The two of them finally ended the meal after eating enough food for 5 people. You see, there are many types of delicious foods here in the scorching basin. If you stay here, you can eat roast meat every day, but if you go to the sky and mountain ranges with me, you'll only be able to eat dried rations every day like we did in the desert. You won't like that, and I'll also feel bad, so be a good girl and stay here, alright? He finally managed to convince Yuna to agree after much effort, and after that, it was time to find her a place to live. He certainly wasn't short on money at the moment, so he took Yuna to the best hotel in the basin and rented a room for 3 months. The hotel had all types of facilities, and after leaving her with a large sum of money, he lived here for 2 days with her to help her grow acclimatized to this new environment. Only then did Tang Wuling leave as he set off for the sky and mountain ranges in his Tang-sect battle vehicle. Driving alone was a horrible feeling. After driving for less than 100 kilometers, the thought of returning to Yuna had already flashed through his mind on more than 10 occasions. Only through tapping into the immense reserves of his willpower was he able to repress his impulsive urges. Beep beep. The ringtone of his soul communicator suddenly sounded. This was a new communicator that Tang Wuling had bought in the scorching basin, and his original one had always been shut down this entire time. What is it, Douluo? Tang Wuling didn't even need to look to know that it was her as she was the only one who knew this number. Father, I miss you. Yuna was clearly about to burst into tears. Be a good girl, Douluo. I'll be back soon. Make sure to meditate lots so you can absorb the energy of the singular velvet sky chrysanthemum and get well soon. Call me if you miss me, and I'll make sure to call you regularly as well, alright? Okay. Yuna was virtually sobbing at this point. Alright, I'm going back. Wait for me. He couldn't take this any longer. He immediately made a U-turn and returned to the scorching basin. As soon as he parked outside the hotel and got out of his car, Yuna had already rushed into his arms. She didn't say anything, and all she did was hold him tightly in her arms. Tang Wuling felt as if his heart were about to melt. How could he bear to leave her behind? A myriad of emotions welled up in his heart at once. All of a sudden, Yuna raised her head with a determined look on her face and said, "Oh, father, I'll be good." Tang Wuling was rather taken aback to hear this. However, Yuna merely smiled at him before getting up on the tips of her toes to plant a kiss on his cheek. She then pushed him back onto the car and said, "Make sure to come back soon." Tang Wuling was at a complete loss, and he was feeling rather speechless at the sight of the smile on Yuna's face. Douluo, how about, "Oh, father, I'll grow up, and I'll wait for you like a good girl," Yuna insisted as she waved farewell. However, Tang Wuling was unable to repress his emotions. What if we? Yuna closed the car door for him with a smile on her face before he could finish. Father came back for me, so that means I'm really important to you. I'm a good girl who knows what's important. Don't worry, father, I'll look after myself. A smile immediately appeared on Tang Wuling's face, and he was feeling slightly more reassured. He slowly drove away from the hotel, looking into the rearview mirror from time to time to see that she was still waving at him from afar. His heart was completely filled with love. Were the conditions at the sky and mountain ranges supposed to be harsh? So what even if they were? Douluo was waiting for him. Tang Wuling rounded the corner and accelerated toward the sky and mountain ranges with brimming battle intent in his heart. The battle vehicle had disappeared from view, and Yuna's waving hand faltered in midair. Tears instantly began to stream down her face. "Why are you crying, little cutie?" A provocative voice sounded from beside her as a dark-skinned young man in a revealing top approached her. "Piss off." Yuna yelled in a ferocious voice. The young man's entire body shuddered, and he seemed to have seen something extremely terrifying within her purple eyes. His dark face immediately turned deathly pale, and he fled the scene as if he were running for his life. Within those clear purple eyes, the vertical pupils gradually reverted back to their original form. Tang Wuling looked on at the distant scenery, and there was only astonishment in his heart. He was greeted by the sight of snowy white mountain peaks that stretched as far as the eyes could see, and the further away the mountains were, the taller they stood, with the tallest of the mountains protruding all the way into the clouds. The distance from here to the sun had to be many times shorter than it was in most other places. Tang Wuling could sense that the light elements here were far too abundant, and that would negatively impact one's body, but he naturally didn't have to worry about that with his immensely powerful physical constitution. There was no longer a road up ahead. If he wanted to get to his destination, then he had to enter this snowy mountain range. This was the first time that Tang Wuling had visited a place like this. The air was very thin here, and one could walk for a long time without seeing another human being. However, the beauty of nature still had him completely entranced. He turned around to see that he passed through a world of greenery to get here, but everything up ahead had been covered under white snow. Standing here, he was like an impossibly tiny and insignificant little raft on an ocean. This was the allure of nature. How could something so beautiful be allowed to fall into ruin? The seed of nature in his glabella seemed to have trembled slightly, as if to resonate with his thoughts. Tang Wuling took a deep breath before striding toward the snowy mountain up ahead. At the same time, he pulled out the GPS that amorous Douluo Zhangxin had given to him before switching it on. This GPS could only be used to find his destination, and he'd been led all the way here from the scorching basin by this device. The GPS was currently instructing him to advance toward that snowy mountain. The air temperature was already very low here, but Tang Wuling was still dressed in his normal clothes. His footsteps were brisk and stable, and the bloodline vortex within his body was rotating naturally to ward off the cold. Soon, he entered the snowy mountain, and the going had become quite tough, but he didn't release his battle armor. Zhangxin had told him that he had to make himself seem like a normal person after coming here, as every single person who joined this army had to travel through this leg of the journey on foot. This was a rule that was set in stone, and even soul masters with flight abilities were no exception to this. In fact, he couldn't even use his martial soul or he'd be disqualified right away. Chapter 923. After Tang Wuling scaled the first mountain, he began to understand why this rule had been set in place. Climbing these snowy mountains was definitely a test of one's willpower. Without being able to use one's martial soul, the journey was quite tough, even with abundant reserves of soul power. The snow on the mountains was very thick, which made walking quite difficult, and the terrain was very steep. The temperatures only plummeted further the higher one climbed, and the air also grew thinner at high altitudes. Even with his physical constitution, his breathing had begun to accelerate after scaling the first snowy mountain. For a normal person, there was no way to complete this task without any modern equipment to assist them. However, he really liked his feeling, and he enjoyed the grind. After resting for a while and eating a few handfuls of snow, Tang Wuling leapt forward and jumped straight down the other side of the mountain from the summit. The thick snow provided him with the ideal padding, and his body quickly slid down along the mountain face, hurtling toward the foot of the mountain. Only Tang Wuling would dare to do something like this, as other people would definitely be concerned about what would happen to them at the conclusion of their descent. Tang Wuling completely spread open his body to maximize the surface area of the snow that he came into contact with, thereby preventing himself from sinking into the thick snow. His body was constantly accelerating, and powder snow was flying past him on either side. He released his spiritual power so he could detect any hazards down below, and constantly adjusted the direction that he was going in accordance with those observations. It had taken him over an hour to scale the mountain, but only several minutes to get down to the other side. As he began near the foot of the mountain, Tang Wuling raised both of his legs and borrowed the momentum to continue sliding forward, taking him several dozens of meters up the next mountain before his momentum finally ran out. He then bent his legs and sat up, and his entire body sank into the accumulated snow on the mountain face. That was so exhilarating. This was most likely what skiing or snowboarding felt like. The snow on these mountains was very thick, and Tang Wuling had learned that under such settings, one had to make as little little sound as possible. Otherwise, it would be very easy to trigger an avalanche. As such, he repressed the urge to let loose a cry of elation before flattening himself against the mountain face. Almost half of his body had sunk into the accumulated snow, and he was climbing upward with difficulty. He didn't use his martial soul, but his hands were as hard as steel essence, and even without using his golden dragon claws, he could still scale the mountain face in a steady manner. Not all sections of the mountain face were as steep as this. The steepness of the terrain fluctuated, and on the flatter sections, he could stand up and walk like normal. He followed the instructions of the GPS, climbing over one mountain after another, and he was steadily closing in on his destination. At this point, his entire body had completely sunk into this snowy mountain. Each successive mountain was taller than the previous one, and the terrain also became steeper and steeper. Tang Wuling sat on the pinnacle of a mountain, and he was finally struck by a hint of exhaustion. An entire day had already passed, and he'd lost count of how many mountains he'd scaled, but he could no longer see the path that he'd come from. The sky gradually began to darken, but his destination was nowhere in sight. With his energy reserves, he could still keep going, but these snowy mountains were extremely cold at night. He could feel that the surrounding temperatures were most likely lower than -50 degrees Celsius, -58 degrees Fahrenheit for our American homies, and his body heat was being expended very quickly. Regardless of how confident he was, it was best to cut himself some slack. Otherwise, he'd be in trouble in the case of unforeseen circumstances. As for how he was going to rest, that wasn't an issue that was going to stump him. He dug a snow cave into the mountain face, then curled up into a ball within it. He then pulled out some blankets from his storage ring to keep the snow and ice at bay. It wasn't exactly a comfortable shelter, but it was certainly better than being out in the cold. In a way, this was quite an amazing experience. Tang Wuling pushed the blankets to compact the surrounding snow in order to make it more solid, then withdrew his own aura. In doing so, his body temperature gradually decreased, and both his blood essence and soul power vortexes began to rotate at a slower rate. As his soul power rank approached 60, a semblance of a crystal was already beginning to form in his soul power vortex, indicating that he was on the brink of successfully manifesting a soul core. As soon as he attained a soul core, his soul energy would form a self-sustaining circuit in his own body. Even without any injection of natural energies, he would be self-subsistent. Following a night of meditation, Tang Wuling woke up, feeling completely reinvigorated. As opposed to going outside right away, he ate some food in his snow cave first. Dried rations didn't taste very good, and their texture was also quite hard, but he had to replenish his energy somehow. He spread open his hands and emerged from the snow cave. The bone-chilling wind buffeted his body, making him shudder while also completely waking him up. He did some stretching, and the blood essence vortex within his body began to accelerate in its rotation. A burst of scorching blood essence fluctuations began to exude from his body, and a visible layer of white mist had formed around him. His aura was like scorching fire, causing water vapors to permeate through the air. He took a few deep breaths to inhale the sparse air in the environment. After taking a look at his GPS, he abruptly jumped up and continued in his journey. The mountain up ahead was extremely precarious, and the mountain faces were close to being completely vertical, but this was a route that he had to take. From the images being displayed on his GPS, it appeared that he would arrive at his destination after scaling this mountain and descending to the other side. However, this mountain was simply far too difficult to scale. Due to its sheer steepness, there wasn't much accumulated snow on the mountain faces, but there were many slippery patches of ice, and it would be extremely difficult to scale it with just one's body alone. Ever since he was a small child, Tang Wuling had developed a personality that would only make him stronger in the face of adversity, and in the face of this latest obstacle, he came up with a plan after just a brief moment of contemplation. He couldn't use his martial soul, and even using the power of the Golden Dragon King would most likely be breaking the rules. So he'd just have to use his own tremendously powerful body. After stabilizing himself, he flattened his right hand like a blade before abruptly stabbing into the wall of ice up ahead. His right hand pierced into the ice with a bell thump, and even though the ice on this mountain was extremely hard, it was nothing in the face of Tang Wuling's terrifying strength. He hung down securely from the wall of ice before also stabbing his other hand in the ice in the same manner. He tested how solid the ice was first before the muscles on his arms abruptly bulged as he pulled downward with all his might, sending his own body propelling straight up into the air. He was using nothing but the power of his arms to do this. After ascending for roughly 10 meters, he ran out of momentum and plunged his hands into the ice again. If he weren't concerned about breaking the wall of ice by exerting too much power, he would have been able to launch himself far more than 10 meters into the air. As a safety precaution, he had no choice but to hold back. Thus, he sprang up over and over again before landing on the wall of ice. His hands were like the most reliable of ice picks, firmly pinning himself to the wall of ice each time before launching him upward again. He was traveling extremely quickly up the mountain base like a giant frog. This section of the mountain was over a kilometer tall, but he reached the summit in only around 15 minutes. He shook out his slightly sore arms and flexed his fingers, which were slightly red from the cold, and they naturally recovered after he circulated his blood essence within his body for a cycle. This was the merit of having an immensely powerful body. In particular, Tang Wuling's blood essence had become noticeably more powerful after consuming those singular velvet sky chrysanthemum petals. He could even feel that if things were to continue like this, he'd be able to break this 10th Golden Dragon King seal soon. He was both looking forward to this, yet also rather concerned. Old Tang had been hibernating for a very long time, but he told him in the past that the second batch of 9 Golden Dragon King seals would be far more difficult to deal with than the first 9. Compared to the second 9 seals, the first 9 were like a process to acclimatize his body to the power of the Golden Dragon King. The energy within the final 9 seals would all be extremely terrifying, and if he couldn't absorb it, then he'd be destroyed. As such, he definitely couldn't do anything rash without making ample preparations. However, risk and reward came hand in hand. It was undoubtedly the case that breaking the 10th seal would result in an extremely powerful ability being bestowed upon him by the Golden Dragon King bloodline, one that would be far superior to his previous 4 abilities. As he continued up the snowy mountain, the terrain gradually began to flatten out. He continued to forge ahead in a rather unsteady manner, and after climbing over a small hill, he was surprised to discover that the terrain on the other side of the hill no longer led downward. Instead, there was a grassland-like existence situated on the summit of the mountain. To put it more accurately, this was a snowland. There were dense bunches of barracks up ahead, and this appeared to be quite a massive military base. There were lookout posts surrounding the area, but no guard towers. It was impossible to see what materials these structures were constructed from due to the thick accumulated snow, but these barracks truly existed, and they covered an area of at least a square kilometer. Chapter 924. Tang Wuling estimated that this place had to be at least 6,000 meters above sea level, so it was completely unsuitable for human habitation. It was undoubtedly the case that this was the destination for his trip, and the place where he was going to be joining the military. The amorous Douluo really had found quite a challenging place for him. In any case, he had finally arrived, and with that in mind, he stretched his body before quickly rushing toward the barracks up ahead. However, he had only run a few steps when a sense of foreboding abruptly welled up in his heart, and he immediately came to a halt. Less than 20 meters ahead of him, 4 figures had emerged from within the snow without any premonition, and they had 4 extremely powerful-looking soul laser guns aimed directly at him. All 4 of them were wearing thick white clothes, and they were holding their respective guns in a very steady manner. Even with Tang Wuling's powers, he could sense a palpable threat from these 4 people. He immediately raised his hands up into the air and yelled, "Don't shoot! I'm here to join the army." One of the 4 soldiers in white put away their weapon while the other 3 were still aiming their guns at Tang Wuling. The soldier made their way over to Tang Wuling without saying anything before conducting a quick pat-down search of his body. Only after ascertaining that he wasn't carrying any weapons did the soldier open the visor on a helmet that they were wearing. "Where's your introduction letter?" Tang Wuling hurriedly fished out the introduction letter that Sang-Shin had given him from his storage ring before handing it over. This was a silver piece of metal with a snowy white bird emblazoned onto its surface. The bird was very majestic and resembled an eagle, but its bodily proportions were slightly different from a normal eagle. It appeared to be far larger than the average eagle, and was very muscular and intimidating. Tang Wuling knew that this was a type of soul beast known as the snow god eagle, and they were said to be the guardian deities of snowy mountains, but they were extremely rare. He had only seen images of such a creature during his lessons at Trek Academy. This symbol seemed to be the crest of this army. Tang Wuling really wasn't all that familiar familiar with the military, and his goal for coming here was very simple. He wanted to integrate himself with this place, then gradually gain control over it through his own powers. The name of this army was the Blood God Legion. That's right, it was Blood God as opposed to Snow God. The pronunciations of the two were the same, but the meanings they conveyed were completely different. This legion didn't even belong to the federal military. Instead, it was a completely special and independent existence. But this was the most powerful army on the entire continent, and they were guarding a secret realm that very few people on this continent knew about. Only the elite of the elite had the right to join this legion, and there were only a few places that had the right to recommend soldiers to this place. These places consisted of Shrek Academy, the Tang Sect, the Battle God Hall, the Spirit Pagoda, and a few other Soulmaster sects that had been around for countless years. There were no weaklings here, as weaklings wouldn't be able to survive in this place, and a military service period here spanned at least 5 years, which was far longer than that of other armies. However, most people chose to stay here for over 10 years. After examining Tang Wulin's introduction letter, the soldier suddenly stood up straight and extended a military salute toward him. The military salute here was different from that of normal federal soldiers. It consisted of making a fist with one's right hand before thumping it into their own chest in a simple yet powerful manner. Tang Wulin knew the importance of integrating into a new environment as quickly as possible, so he also made a fist with his right hand to return the salute. However, the soldier immediately grabbed onto his arm to stop him. "You have no right to do that yet. Come with me." The soldier turned and strode toward the barracks as they spoke. As expected, this place really was quite different. Tang Wulin's heart stirred slightly, but he still quickly followed along. Meanwhile, the other 3 soldiers withdrew into the snow again, and the snow above them quickly became flat and even. It was as if they'd never appeared here. The soldier led Tang Wulin over to the barracks, and the snow near the barracks had clearly been swept, revealing the hard ground underneath. For the first time in days, Tang Wulin was able to walk without having to wade through mounds of snow. The soldier dusted off the snow on their body before quickly entering the barracks. The environment in the barracks was vastly different from the outside world. Everything was very neat and orderly here, and aside from the fact that the entire structure was surrounded by snow, it appeared to be no different from normal barracks. However, Tang Wulin discovered that the people here were very few and far in between. There weren't even any patrolling soldiers. Tang Wulin didn't ask any questions about this. The best way to gain an understanding of a place was to see and listen to things for himself. Furthermore, from the tone of the soldier that had led him to this place, he could deduce that the soldiers here were most likely all quite proud and perhaps even slightly xenophobic. Under these circumstances, all he could do was display his powers to win everyone's approval as soon as he could rather than waste time with words. He wondered if the legions that all of his friends had been sent to were also as strange as this one. The soldier led Tang Wulin over to a building, then pressed their palm against something, and a beam of light swept over them, following which the metal gate up ahead was opened. "Come with me." After entering the building, a burst of warm air immediately surged toward them, and the soothing heat provided an indescribable sense of comfort. Even the air here seemed to be more abundant than it was outside. Tang Wulin heaved a long and content sigh. The soldier turned back to take a glance at him before removing the helmet, and Tang Wulin was greeted by the sight of a woman with a head of long brown hair. She was very tall, and appeared to be around 25 to 26 years of age. She was wearing a thick military uniform, which was why Tang Wulin had been unable to discern her gender prior to this point. As such, he was rather taken aback to discover that this was a woman. The female soldier wore a frosty look on her face. "Stop daydreaming and come with me. Let me tell you this, from now on, you need to prepare yourself. Whether you'll be allowed to stay here will be decided during the next 3 days. Thank you." Tang Wulin nodded in response. At this point, Tang Wulin was still severely underdressed for the setting, and the female soldier glanced at his attire before leaving a cryptic remark. "Arrogance is the fastest way to death." She then immediately turned around and continued onward. Tang Wulin was rather amused to hear this. He knew that she had to have thought that he was showing off by wearing so little in comparison to everyone else here. In reality, he wasn't. Completely immune to the effects of extreme temperatures, but the air temperature here really didn't affect him much. Furthermore, the stimulus provided by the cold increased the speed of his blood essence vortex's rotation, so it was actually assisting him in his cultivation. Tang Wulin followed the woman into the building, and his expression quickly changed. There were all types of devices and apparatus all around him, most of which he didn't even recognize. There were very few people in here as well. After walking through a passageway, the female soldier led him into a room, and Tang Wulin finally saw a second person in that room. This was also a female soldier who appeared to be in her 40s, and her epaulets carried 1 line and 2 stars, indicating that she was a lieutenant. "Lieutenant, this is a newbie. Please arrange a trial for him." The female soldier's expression remained quite cold. The middle-aged military official immediately rose to her feet before pounding her chest as part of a military salute. "Yes, Major." Major? The one who had brought him here was a major rather than a normal soldier. Tang Wulin had studied military ranks quite extensively, and he was quite surprised to see such a young major, while the lieutenant was clearly a lot older. After nodding to acknowledge the lieutenant, the female major turned and left. Tang Wulin looked on at her departing figure, and he became even more intrigued by this place. "Don't be surprised, little guy. The major is always this serious when she's completing missions. You don't have to be alarmed by our military ranks, either. Here in the Blood God Legion, age is completely irrelevant. Power and accolades are the only things that matter. I'm an administration official here, and my husband fights in the Legion, so I essentially came here with him as family. If you can pass the trial, you'll learn all of the rules here in the future." Chapter 925. "Thank you," Tang Wulin replied with a genuine and benevolent smile. He was extremely handsome to begin with, so his energetic smile was very endearing. The lieutenant said, "Come with me. It's been a while since we had our last new addition. You're a handsome young lad, but I have to caution you that no matter where you come from, arrogance is a cardinal sin here. The Blood God Legion is no ordinary army. Only exceptional prodigies are recommended to this place, but less than a third of them actually get to stay here. I can see that you're a polite young man, and I hope that you'll be able to stay here." Tang Wulin asked, "Are we commencing the trial right away?" "There's no need for registration," the lieutenant replied. "There's no need for that. You were only brought here after your identity was verified, and there's no point in registering you prior to your completion of the trial. As for why we're commencing the trial right away, there's a simple explanation. Your enemies will never tell you when they're going to strike." Tang Wulin's expression stiffened slightly upon hearing this. Indeed, Shrek City had been completely taken by surprise by its enemies. "You're right." The lieutenant led Tang Wulin out of the room and into what appeared to be a warehouse. "You can choose any weapon from here, but remember that you won't be able to use any soul power in the upcoming trial. Hence, you'll only be able to rely on your body and the weapon of your choice, so make sure to pick one that you're more adept at using." A trial where usage of soul power was prohibited. Tang Wulin's heart jolted slightly upon hearing this. Would his bloodline power be affected as well? There were all types of weapons in the warehouse, many of which were modern soul weapons, including things like laser guns and soul cannons. There were weapons to cater to everyone, and all of them were portable weapons that were suitable for single combat. Tang Wulin could only recognize around a third of all of these weapons, and all of the weapons he recognized were ones that he knew how to use. However, after some careful consideration, Tang Wulin stepped forward and chose a long black alloy staff. Even if he couldn't use his bloodline power, he was still supremely confident in his own strength. As for long-range soul weapons, he could use some of them, but he certainly wasn't good at it. He was only proficient at using long-range attacks when piloting mechas. The lieutenant raised an eyebrow upon seeing his choice, and a slightly full-on look appeared on her face. "Looks like you still chose your pride over practicality. Come with me." Her tone had turned rather cold and unfriendly, but she didn't say anything further. She led him out of the warehouse before entering an extremely massive building at the center of the base. The tip of the building was of a conical shape, and it was around 50 meters tall, making it the tallest building in the entire base. After passing through a set of doors, Tang Wulin finally caught sight of some other soldiers. There were several dozens of people in here, all of whom were wearing white military uniforms. The uniforms were very beautiful to behold, and each of them had a snow god eagle crest on the chest, identical to the one on his introduction letter. No one paid any heed to Tang Wulin and the lieutenant. However, Tang Wulin discovered from the epaulets of the soldiers here that they were all military officials, and even the lowest ranked ones among them were second lieutenants. There were no ordinary soldiers among them. Could it be that this was the control base of the Blood God Legion? The lieutenant led Tang Wulin over to an elevator, and the doors opened before the two of them walked inside. All of a sudden, a cold voice sounded, "Hold on." Another person entered the elevator just as the voice rang out. Tang Wulin discovered that this was a female soldier with a pair of major epaulets on her shoulders. It was none other than the female major that had led Tang Wulin into the barracks. She had already removed her thick coat, so she was only wearing her white military uniform at the moment. Her uniform was completely devoid of creases, and she was looking very sharp with her pristine white uniform and golden epaulets. "Major." The lieutenant immediately extended a military salute, and the major also returned the salute. However, this salute really didn't suit women all that well. She was very tall and slender, and also quite beautiful. On top of that, she had a sense of heroic spirit about her that normal women didn't have. However, that certainly didn't arrest her physical development in the slightest, and her chest rippled like jelly as she extended her chest-thumping salute. Tang Wulin's lips twitched involuntarily upon seeing this. I'll supervise him during his trial. You can go back, the major instructed. The lieutenant faltered slightly upon hearing this. You're going to oversee his trial in person. The major nodded in response. That's right. I've assessed the footage of how he got here, so I'll be overseeing his trial. Yes. The lieutenant extended another military salute before exiting the elevator. The doors of the elevator closed, and Tang Wulin could sense that it was traveling in a downward direction. Thus, he and the female major were the only ones in this rather small enclosed space. Tang Wulin cleared his throat and said, "Hello, Major. My name is Tang Wulin. You'll refer to me as Superior," the female major said in a cold voice. "Yes, Superior," Tang Wulin hurriedly replied. "Stand up straight," the female major commanded. Tang Wulin faltered slightly before doing as he was told. He wasn't used to being ordered around like this, but he decided to bear with it after recalling what the lieutenant had told him earlier. The female major didn't say anything else, and she certainly wasn't displaying any intention to introduce herself. Moments later, the elevator door was opened following a crisp ding. After exiting the elevator, they passed through a metal corridor before turning left, and Tang Wulin was led into a room by the major. After entering the room, a surprised look immediately appeared on Tang Wulin's face as he was struck by a sense of deja vu. Why did this look so much like the entrance to the spirit ascension plane of the intermediate spirit pagoda? There was a series of glass covers around the room, and judging from their sizes, it was undoubtedly the case that they were designed to hold people. The major made her way over to the control panel, and her hands flew rapidly over the keys as she typed in a series of commands. Two of the glass covers slowly rose up, and all of the apparatus in the room also lit up. Have you been to the spirit ascension plane before? The major asked. I have. Tang Wulin replied in a truthful manner. The major nodded, and said, the setting of your trial will be similar in nature to the spirit ascension plane, and your mission is very simple. Protect me in there until the conclusion of your trial. All right. Tang Wulin nodded before making his way over to one of the raised glass covers. The major's eyes narrowed slightly before she quickly followed along, and she cautioned, as a reminder, you won't be able to use your soul power in there, so the only thing you can rely on is yourself and your weapon. Understood? Understood. The lieutenant had already informed him of this earlier. At the same time, Tang Wulin had also formed a basic judgment about this trial. The setting would be similar to that of the spirit ascension plane, and he couldn't use any soul power to fight the enemies in there. After walking into the glass cover, it slowly closed, and a series of metal plates were pressed against his body. Metallic rungs appeared behind him to fix his body into place, and the surrounding area suddenly became brighter. It had been a long time since Tang Wulin had last visited the spirit ascension plane, and he closed his eyes as he carefully felt all of the changes taking place around him. A slight pain speared through his limbs before converging in his brain, and a string of shudders ran through his body before his brain became completely blank. Tang Wulin could faintly sense the stimulus from the electrical currents, changes in the statistical fluctuations, and also spatial energy fluctuations. These were things that he hadn't been able to sense in the past, and they only become apparent to him as his spiritual power had reached the spirit of this realm. There wasn't really any discomfort, and when he opened his eyes again, he found himself situated on a vast expanse of snow with the aloe staff that he'd chosen in his hand. What was even more surprising to him was that the barracks that he'd just entered was situated nearby. Chapter 926. Was this supposed to be a virtual reality setting? This was quite interesting. However, there was a massive bottomless hole next to him, and the hole was entirely inky black in color. There were some indescribable auras rising up from down below, causing his mind to shudder slightly. He inspected his internal condition, and sure enough, he could no longer sense his soul power. It was as if his soul power vortex had completely disappeared from within his body. Thankfully, his bloodline vortex was still there, and his blood essence power was still extremely abundant, so he hadn't been impacted much. Right at this moment, light flashed and the female major appeared beside him. She was in the exact same attire as before, but when she caught sight of him, a different expression finally broke through her cold facade. It was a surprise. How did you get in here so quickly? The major asked. Is there a competition for speed? Tang Wulin answered her question with one of his own. The female major's expression returned to normal, and she pointed into the abyss. Jump into it. All right. Tang Wulin did as he was told and leapt into the black hole without any hesitation. He didn't know what was down there, but this was only a simulated world, so there was nothing to fear. After everything that he'd been through, would he be afraid of falling to his death in a simulation? Furthermore, with his current physical constitution, it would be quite difficult for him to fall to his death even if he tried. The major also jumped into the abyss right after him. Everything in the surrounding area began to turn dark, but Tang Wulin's eyes glowed with purple light as he unleashed his purple demon eyes. Cultivating the purple demon eyes could improve his spiritual power, and conversely, after one's spiritual power reached a certain level, it would also begin to reciprocate the purple demon eyes. As such, Tang Wulin was already beginning to progress toward the third level of his purple demon eyes. Even though there was still quite a gap for him to bridge, the cultivation of the purple demon eyes was a process of accumulation anyway. After cultivating it for a long enough time, everything would naturally fall into place. Through the use of his purple demon eyes, he was able to discern that this was a cave. The walls of the cave were quite uneven, so it didn't appear to have been artificially excavated. After falling for around 100 meters, a massive net appeared down below to stop their fall. As their bodies gradually stabilized, Tang Wulin caught sight of a series of holes beside the net that had broken their fall. The holes were all of different sizes. The largest ones had diameters of around 10 meters, while the smallest ones were only around 2 meters in diameter. Furthermore, these holes were very irregular in size and seemed to have been smashed into the rock faces by something. The female major climbed along the net toward one of the holes while waving a hand toward Tang Wulin. Tang Wulin quickly followed along with his staff in his hand. After he arrived beside the major, she said, "From now on, there could be danger at every turn. What you have to do is progress onward while protecting me. The result of your trial will depend on how deep you can go. Understood?" "Yes." Tang Wulin nodded in response. He then brandished his staff and led the way into the hole. The hole that this major had chosen had a diameter of around 3 meters, and it was completely pitch black in here as well. Tang Wulin's eyes narrowed slightly. Even though he couldn't use his soul power, he still had full access to his spiritual power, and with his sensory abilities, coupled with his purple demon eyes, he could just barely see around 30 meters away from him. This was already quite a remarkable feat in this cave with barely any light. However, the further he progressed, the darker the surrounding area became, and even the effect of his purple demon eyes was rapidly on the wane. Tang Wulin wasn't walking very quickly, and the major followed him in an unhurried manner. Tang Wulin suddenly wished that he had an infrared thermal imaging device with him. That would make things a lot easier. As things currently were, he could only rely on his own senses. However, his aloe staff was also somewhat useful in this situation as well. He was able to use it as a guide stick, occasionally striking the rock faces on either side, as well as the ground up ahead, in order to ascertain whether they were in a safe setting. All of a sudden, a gust of wind surged toward them, and Tang Wulin reflexively swung his staff toward the gust of wind while retreating a half step with his right foot to position his body in front of the major. A dull thump rang out, and Tang Wulin could feel that he'd struck something. He focused his purple demon eyes up ahead to discover that it was a bat-like creature. It wasn't very large, but it possessed considerable ramming force that was most likely several hundred kilograms on impact. That wasn't much to him, but if a normal person were in his shoes, they would have most likely been completely bowled over. Even after being struck by his staff, the bat-like creature didn't die. It let loose a sharp screech before springing up and pouncing toward Tang Wulin again, scratching toward his body with its 4 claws. Tang Wulin certainly wasn't going to allow it to tax the land. He struck the bat with his staff with unerring accuracy, and on this occasion, he used a lot more of his strength. Another dull thump rang out, and the bat was sent flying through the air. In the next instant, instant, its body exploded in midair. Tang Wuling had controlled the power of his strike to perfection. He condensed his power to within the end of his staff, and only allowed it to erupt after the staff struck the bat, thereby allowing him to immediately send it flying. The major behind him raised her eyebrows slightly, but Tang Wuling naturally couldn't see her expression in the darkness. He continued onward after only a brief pause. While passing by the carcass of that bat, he squatted down slightly before focusing his gaze on it. Much to his surprise, the bat's body was rapidly shrinking, and it disappeared right before his eyes. At the same time, he was struck by a faint notion that some type of energy seemed to have proliferated through the air. Was this thing not an actual being of substance? Tang Wuling's brows furrowed slightly, and he recalled back to the instant that he pulverized the bat's body. No blood had appeared, and instead, a ball of energy seemed to have exploded in that instant. However, in contrast with the spirit ascension plane, this energy didn't replenish his body, nor did it bolster his soul rings. Had these creatures been created solely for the purpose of this trial? Tang Wuling continued onward with a hint of befuddlement in his heart. Another gust of wind swept forth, but it wasn't alone this time. Instead, several gusts of wind were hurtling toward them from up ahead at the same time. Tang Wuling remained completely unflustered as he injected his power into the staff, then gently swept it through to lash out at all of the oncoming assailants. At the same time, his own body remained as still and resolute as a mountain. Thump, thump, thump. 3 dull thumps rang out in rapid succession, and 3 bats' bodies exploded. The carcasses then quickly began to vanish just like the body of the first bat. Tang Wuling continued onward, and bats appeared one after another. At times, they emerged one at a time, while at other times, as many as 6 or 7 of them would appear at once. On those occasions, their bodies would fill up virtually the entire cave. However, not even a single one of them managed to break through Tang Wuling's defenses, and all of them were destroyed by his staff. After forging ahead for about 100 meters, light gradually began to appear, and the number of bats also began to decrease. The light wasn't very bright, but it was still better than having no light at all. After reaching the conclusion of the tunnel, Tang Wuling turned left, but he stopped cold in his tracks after taking just a few more steps. At the same time, an astonished look appeared on his face. They had arrived in a massive cave with an area that was comparable to that of a sports stadium. On one face of the massive cave were around 100 holes of different sizes, and they were situated at heights of around 100 meters. At this moment, there were at least 100 of the 4-claws bats that he'd just faced flying in the air within the cave, and even more of these bats were flying out of the holes up above. The light was also coming from those holes, and it wasn't very bright, but it was enough for Tang Wuling to see everything with his purple demon eyes. Was the objective of his trial to defeat these bats? Tang Wuling's expression changed slightly, and right at this moment, the major arrived beside him before suddenly raising her head and smiling at him. This was the first time that Tang Wuling had seen this major smile, but no matter how he looked at it, he couldn't help but feel that this was quite a sinister smile. Immediately thereafter, the major said to him, "Make sure to protect me." She then abruptly stepped forward and began to charge into the cave up ahead. Tang Wuling's lips twitched upon seeing this. Was she artificially increasing the difficulty of his trial? Despite his disgruntled thoughts, he reacted extremely quickly, and he immediately sped over to behind the major after stomping a foot into the ground. All of the 4-clawed bats began to emit sharp screeches at the sight of the intruders, and one bat after another descended from the sky, hurtling toward them from all directions. Chapter 927. The major continued to rush directly toward the center of the cave as if she couldn't even see these bats. Tang Wuling waved his staff through the air, using it like a spear and vanquishing at least one 4-clawed bat with every single strike. One staff projection after another flashed beside the major, and not even a single bat was able to reach within 2 meters of her. The surprise in her eyes became even more pronounced. She had seen many newbies undertaking this trial, and there were some exceptional snipers who could control the situation, as well as some who used all types of advanced soul weapons to resolve this predicament, but it was extremely rare to see someone protect her at such close range using nothing more than their own strength and battle experience. There was naturally a reason behind her decision to oversee Tang Wuling's trial in person. After taking Tang Wuling to the lieutenant, she had pulled up the surveillance footage near the snowy mountains and witnessed the process through which Tang Wuling had reached their base. Her first thought after seeing the footage was that he'd completed the journey far too quickly. He'd done so in less than a third of the time it had taken her to complete the same journey for the first time. In her eyes, this guy didn't even seem like a human being anymore. He was able to use his bare hands as ice picks and propellers to launch himself up the mountain without using any soul power, and that was truly astonishing. As such, her curiosity had led to her decision to oversee Tang Wuling's trial. Under normal circumstances, the general contents of the trial had to be introduced to the trial taker in advance, but she had refrained from doing so. Furthermore, after reaching this point, she was supposed to travel quite slowly, but she had chosen to run through this area instead. She had intentionally raised the level of difficulty of this trial because she wanted to see just what this newbie was capable of. As it turned out, Tang Wuling wasn't just a brute with nothing more than explosive power. The ramming force of these 4-clawed bats could reach as high as 500 kilograms, and even 4-ring soul masters with remarkably powerful physical constitutions would have a hard time keeping them at bay. However, in the face of Tang Wuling, these bats were dropping like flies. After the major reached the center of the cave, more than half of the 4-clawed bats here had already been killed by Tang Wuling. However, he also realized an issue. These 4-clawed bats didn't seem to have any sense of fear. So many of their brethren had already perished, but they were still flying toward Tang Wuling and the major in a bloodthirsty frenzy. Even soul beasts wouldn't do something like this. Their attacks were extremely decisive, and Tang Wuling could only see ferocity in their eyes without any sense of fear or hesitation. What kind of living beings were these? Had they been created by the Blood God Legion just for these trials? While these thoughts were running through his mind, the vast majority of the bats in this cave had already been killed by him. With the large quantity of 4-clawed bats that had been slain and the dim light in the cave, Tang Wuling was able to catch sight of wisps of energy rising up from their bodies before gradually converging together, then drifting toward those holes. Tang Wuling turned to the major. "Is that it?" A smile appeared on the major's face once again. Of course not. Right at this moment, a low smell abruptly rang out, and a massive bat suddenly flew out of one of the medium-sized caves. This bat was more than twice as large as the previous ones, and it had 6 claws as opposed to 4. It spread open its wings and abruptly let loose a sharp screech. Tang Wuling's expression changed slightly at the sight of the ripples in the air being created by its screeching. Was this a sound wave attack? He immediately released his spiritual power in response. He knew that this kind of sound wave attack couldn't be nullified just by blocking his ears. At the same time, he raised a hand and drew the major into his arms. He wound his left arm around her waist, and golden light erupted from his eyes. Due to the fact that she's been caught in Tang Wuling's embrace, the major was oblivious to the golden light emanating from his eyes. This was a solid and warm embrace, and after being pressed against Tang Wuling's body, the major instantly felt her heart rate begin to quicken. The anticipated sound wave attack seemed to have been blocked by something and didn't strike her as she'd expected. The 6-clawed bat in the air let loose a vicious screech, and it suddenly withdrew its wings before hurtling directly toward Tang Wuling like a speeding arrow. At the same time, it was letting loose one sharp screech after another to unleash a relentless barrage of soundwave attacks. Tang Wuling erupted coldly, and 2 beams of light suddenly erupted from within his eyes like purple lightning. The major just so happened to raise her head at this moment, so she got a glimpse of the purple light shooting out of his eyes. Right at this moment, Tang Wuling rose up into the air with his left arm still locked tightly around the major's waist, but he'd already lashed out with his right hand using his alloy staff. The 6-clawed bat was quite powerful, as evidenced by the fact that it was still able to react even after being struck by the purple demon eyes' spiritual attack. It spread open its wings again, and its 6 claws, which were clearly far larger than those of the 4-clawed bats, grabbed toward Tang Wuling's staff. Thump. The 6-clawed bat's body was over 2 meters in length, but it was still sent flying like a cannonball. Right before the major's astonished eyes, it suffered the same fate as its 4-clawed counterparts. Its body exploded into countless pieces that flew in all directions. He destroyed that 6-clawed bat in just one strike without using any soul power. The major felt as if her brain had begun to short-circuit. However, Tang Wuling didn't think much of this. He released the major in an apologetic manner and said, "Sorry for encroaching on your personal space. It's just that I may not have been able to protect you from that bat sound wave attacks if you were too far away from me." The major didn't say anything, but her expression had clearly changed. Her original curiosity and intrigue had grown even more pronounced. In the beginning, she had thought that Tang Wuling was too conceited as he'd chosen a staff as his weapon. However, that thought was completely dispelled after she witnessed him destroying a 6-clawed bat with just a single staff strike. With the close quarters combat ability that he displayed, he was definitely powerful enough to earn a pass in this trial. However, the trial of the Blood God Legion wasn't just a test of power. What was more important was one's personality and moral code. There were many people in the Blood God Legion, but all of them were true comrades that could entrust one another with their lives. The trial for newbies involved protecting someone as it was a test of whether they'd be willing to sacrifice themselves to protect others in a dangerous situation. However, the prerequisite for this was that a dangerous situation had to be created. How was this test supposed to be conducted without a sufficient level of danger? The Major couldn't just stop this trial here, so he chose to remain silent. The 6-clawed bat had been slain, and the steady streams of 4-clawed bats that had been rushing out of the caves finally stopped. However, only a short while later, 3 more massive 6-clawed bats emerged from within the caves. 3 bats at once didn't just entail 3 times the power. Not only did these creatures resemble bats in appearance, they also fought in a very similar manner to bats. Not only did they possess extremely powerful combat prowess, they were also very adept at teamwork. As such, this was going to be a far more rigorous test than just facing one 6-clawed bat. Just as the Major was looking forward to how Tang Wuling was going to handle this situation, he had already sprung into action. On this occasion, he didn't wait passively for their opponents to come to them. Without the harassment from the 4-clawed bats, he didn't have to worry about the Major's safety. As such, he sprang into action as soon as the 3 6-clawed bats began to emerge. His alloy staff transformed into a black shadow, and a sharp whistling sound rang out as it hurtled directly toward one of the 6-clawed bats. At the same time, he completed a run-up before stomping both feet into the ground, propelling him toward the second 6-clawed bat. The staff was the first to reach its target. A resounding boom rang out, and before the 6-clawed bat had even fully emerged from its cave, its body had already been pulverized. The other 2 6-clawed bats had only just emerged, and Tang Wuling was already right in front of one of them. Chapter 928. His right hand clenched into a fist, which he launched directly at the 6-clawed bat up ahead. The bat had only just stabilized its body after emerging from the cave, so it had no time to evade, and could only retaliate with its 6 claws. This was going to be a direct clash between 6 claws and one fist. However, right at this moment, Tang Wuling employed a little trick. He tucked his legs beneath him before gently tapping his feet against 2 of the bat's claws. In doing so, his body was elevated slightly, thereby allowing him to evade the bat's claws while his fist rammed viciously into its head. Boom! The 6-clawed bat's body was reduced to pieces. Tang Wuling drew upon the recoil force to perform a backward somersault before descending from the sky. During his descent, he unleashed his controlling crane capturing dragon to draw the alloy staff that he just hurled away back to him. Despite the fact that he had no access to his soul power, his blood essence vortex was still rotating at a rapid rate, so he was able to use his controlling crane capturing dragon anyway, and the alloy staff immediately returned to his grasp. The final 6-clawed bat was extremely cunning. As opposed to attacking him, it pounced directly toward the Major instead. The Major stood still on the spot, but her brows had furrowed slightly. Tang Wuling had indeed just displayed immense combat prowess, but he would not be welcome to the Blood God Legion if he were just a ruffian who didn't care about his comrades. However, right at this moment, a black shadow flashed past, and a dull thump rang out. The 6-clawed bat was just about to reach her when its body was completely punctured by the alloy staff from the side. The momentum of the staff sent it flying toward the rock face in the distance, and only in the instant that the staff struck the rock face did the terrifying power imbued within it completely erupt, instantly shattering the 6-clawed bat's body. Just as the Major was looking on in a flabbergasted manner, Tang Wuling had already returned to her side. Right at this moment, a black shadow reached Tang Wuling like lightning. It wasn't very large, but it was very long, and it seemed to be a snake, but it had rows of tiny claws under its body. As soon as it reached Tang Wuling, it abruptly opened its massive mouth before chomping down upon him. This creature had appeared far too abruptly, and it had appeared virtually right after Tang Wuling held his staff through the air for the second time to destroy the third 6-clawed bat. Of course, its target was the Major as opposed to Tang Wuling. He had been fast enough to position himself in front of the Major, but he no longer had his staff. The creature opened its mouth until it was in excess of a meter in diameter, and there were rows of menacing sharp teeth within its massive mouth. What was even more terrifying was that it had a long tongue, which shot forth toward Tang Wuling like a lightning-fast spear. If he were to address its spear-like tongue, then he wouldn't be able to oppose its sharp teeth. Furthermore, he had only just managed to wedge himself between the creature and the Major, so no matter how one looked at it, he wouldn't have enough time to formulate an effective defense against this creature's attack. However, in this dire situation, Tang Wuling did something that came as a complete surprise to the Major. He seemed to have intentionally slipped, and his entire body fell backward. Not only that, but his right arm struck the backs of the Major's knees, causing her to also keel over and fall backward. She let loose a cry of surprise, and she couldn't control her body as the creature's spear-like tongue passed over not far above her face. However, she refrained from closing her eyes. All exceptional soldiers had to have the presence of mind to keep their eyes open during dangerous situations, and she turned her head toward Tang Wuling. As a result, she was greeted by the sight of Tang Wuling supporting his body with one leg as he fell backward while his other leg kicked directly upward, striking the underside of the creature's mouth. The kick contained extremely terrifying power, and the creature's mouth was immediately sealed shut as its chin quickly crashed into the roof of its mouth. Its own extended tongue was severed by its sharp teeth, and on top of that, Tang Wuling's enormous strength has shattered all of its teeth, sending them flying out of its mouth as pulverized fragments. At the same time, he had the presence of mind to pull against the backs of the Major's knees, and she immediately felt a burst of gentle power sweeping toward her, stabilizing her body in the instant right before she was about to crush to the ground. Tang Wuling then shot back and wound his right arm around her waist. He gently slapped his left hand against the ground, and he didn't appear to have exerted much force at all, but in the next instant, both he and the Major were on their feet. Everything had taken place in the span of just a few short breaths, but Tang Wuling's movements were extremely smooth and appeared to be completely unhurried. The snake-like creature's tongue and teeth had been completely destroyed by his kick, and its body was flung up into the air. Tang Wuling tapped a foot against the ground and rose up into the air, rushing quickly toward the alloy staff with his arm still wound around the Major's waist. Only then did the Major return to her senses, and there was only one thought in her mind. You can do that. At this moment, a string of ferocious howls erupted from within the cave. The snake that Tang Wuling had just kicked flying suddenly faltered in midair before a massive paw emerged from the largest of the caves, grabbing onto the snake and abruptly wrenching it backward. The snake then vanished amid a blood-curdling howl. At this point, Tang Wuling had only just pulled out his staff, and a grim expression appeared on his face. What was that thing? The diameter of the claw that had just been revealed was over 6 meters. Proportionally speaking, there was no way that the owner of that paw could fit into that cave. Furthermore, this was the first time during this trial that he'd been struck by a sense of threat. He dragged the Major behind him, then brandished his staff and fixed an intense gaze into that cave. After a brief pause, the entire cave suddenly began to tremor slightly, and plumes of mist abruptly began to emerge from all of the holes at once. A hint of astonishment flashed through the Major's eyes. She clearly recognized what this mist was, but at the same time, it was quite apparent that she didn't expect something like this to appear during the trial. The dense mist was yellow in color, and as soon as it emerged, Tang Wuling could feel a change in the temperature in the entire cave. It wasn't just a simple increase or decrease in temperature. Instead, it was fluctuating in an unsteady manner. A sense of invisible pressure swept forth from within the mist. What was this thing? Tang Wuling chose to calmly observe the situation rather than rush forward to attack. A creature that posed a threat to him had to be extremely powerful. The mist quickly converged, and a massive figure gradually appeared. This was a monstrous creature that Tang Wuling had never seen before. Its head resembled that of a giant dragon, and its body was as huge as a small mountain. It was entirely covered in dark green scales, and there were 3 legs supporting its body. Its upper body was extremely muscular, and it had a pair of very long arms. Tang Wuling had just seen one of the paws that was attached to its 2 arms, and both of those paws were over 6 meters in diameter. There was a massive tail trailing along behind it, and it had 4 crimson eyes, all of which were emitting an extremely vicious light. Be careful, this is a barn, the Major cautioned. Barn? What was that supposed to be? The Major had told him the name of this creature, but that information wasn't very useful to him at all. It was quite apparent that this monster would be very troublesome to deal with. Tang Wuling said in a grim voice, "You stay right beside this rock face and don't move. I'll take care of this thing." He strode forward and charged directly toward the monster as he spoke. This thing was way too massive. It appeared to be over 40 meters tall, and among all of the land-dwelling creatures that Tang Wuling had seen, it was second only to a tyrant dragon in size. It was just a pity that he couldn't use his martial soul at the moment. Otherwise, he'd be able to summon his tyrant dragon as a perfect counter to this thing. Compared to this massive barn, Tang Wuling was extremely tiny and insignificant. All of a sudden, his body abruptly sprang upward like a speeding arrow. He swung his staff directly toward the barn, while the Major looked on from the corner, and for some reason, her heart trembled slightly in that instant. Not everyone had the courage to charge directly toward a monster like a barn, especially when they were facing such a being for the very first time. The barn let loose a roar of fury, and its eyes lit up like balls of fire. It opened its mouth to blast a plume of dark purple flames toward Tang Wuling, and the major reflexively closed her eyes. She really didn't want to see Tang Wuling being incinerated into nothingness by this abyssal monster. Without any equipment, a normal soul master would be instantly melted away by the barn's demonic abyssal flames and reduced to a vengeful spirit. However, the sound that traveled to her ears in the next instant was a roar of pain and fury from the barn. She hurriedly opened her eyes, and she was astonished to see that a golden figure had already appeared above the barn's head. She would never forget the astonishing scenes that she witnessed next. The barn's enormous body was sent flying like a gargantuan cannonball before crashing heavily into the rock face in the distance, then thudding onto the ground. Tang Wuling descended from the sky and threw away the staff in his hand. He had no choice. The staff had already been completely bent and was unusable. Chapter 929. At this moment, his entire body had been covered in golden scales, and golden dragon claws had emerged from his hands. 4 golden rings of light emerged from beneath his feet before revolving around his body and gently pulsating in a rhythmic manner. Golden soul rings? I'm impossible. Humans can't use their martial souls in this simulated realm. The major was already completely flabbergasted. She was then greeted by the sight of Tang Wuling springing up into the air again, and his speed was at least doubled. He shot forth like a golden cannonball, hurtling directly toward the barn. The barn clambered up from the ground, and its body was also astonishingly powerful. Tang Wuling had used his golden dragon body and golden dragon tyrant body to force his way through its demonic abyssal flames, and only then had he been able to catch it completely off guard before sending it flying. At this moment, there was a clear indentation on the barn's head, and that had just been inflicted by Tang Wuling. However, Tang Wuling was still feeling rather remorseful. If he had just used his golden dragon spear, then the barn wouldn't have just been sent flying. The barn let loose a roar of fury as it lashed out at Tang Wuling with its massive dragon claws, while dark green light began to radiate from its scales. Even in this world, it was an extremely powerful being, and the fact that a puny human had managed to harm it sent it into a fit of deranged fury. Its terrifying aura was causing the entire space to tremble in its wake. Right at this moment, a loud dragon's roar erupted from Tang Wuling's mouth, following which his third golden soul ring lit up. A massive golden dragon head radiated outward with his body at its center, and the barn's deranged roar was instantly drowned out. Immediately thereafter, the dragon head surged forward, and Tang Wuling pressed forward with both hands, transforming his golden dragon roar into golden dragon shocks the heavens. Boom! Golden and dark green light clashed violently in midair, and Tang Wuling's body faltered for an instant before he was hurled toward the roof of the cave. Meanwhile, the barn was sent flying toward the distant rock face again. Right at this moment, even as Tang Wuling was flying upward, a streak of golden light erupted from his body like a bolt of lightning that was threatening to pierce through heaven and earth. It caught up to the barn in the blink of an eye, and the monster reflexively raised one of its massive paws to shield itself. But the golden light nearly punctured through its paw and plunged itself right in the center of its 4 eyes. Tang Wuling was a disciple of the Tang sect. Even though the golden dragon spear was a little too large to be referred to as a hidden weapon, the same hand technique still applied. A blood-curdling howl erupted from the barn's mouth, and countless streams of dark green energy rapidly converged toward the golden spear. Having been forcibly drawn out of its body, Tang Wuling descended from the sky, and he was panting heavily. The battle had been extremely brief, but he'd unleashed everything he had during those few attacks, and he was now being struck by a sense of overexertion. During that clash, the barn's strength had been far superior to what he'd imagined. After unleashing the full extent of its power, its strength wasn't inferior to Tang Wuling's by much. If it weren't for the fact that Tang Wuling's golden dragon roar had intimidated his opponent, it would have been impossible for him to land that killing blow with his golden dragon spear without being injured by the barn during that clash. Tang Wuling landed on the ground, and the barn's giant body was still trembling spasmodically as it tried to struggle away from the golden dragon spear, but it was already too late. The dark green strings of energy turned the golden dragon spear into a dark green color, but the barn's gigantic body was beginning to disintegrate, and it soon disappeared into nothingness. Golden light flashed from the golden dragon spear, and all of the dark green color faded before it returned to Tang Wuling's grasp in the next instant. Tang Wuling instantly felt an extremely pure burst of energy inject itself into his body. This energy couldn't replenish currently non-existent soul power, but his bloodline soul rings shattered violently before accelerating in their rotation. A burst of pure essence had appeared in his blood essence, and it was kind of like the golden dragon king essence that he absorbed after breaking his golden dragon king seals. The quantity was far inferior in comparison, but it was still energy of an extremely high level of purity. He knew that this was a simulation as opposed to reality, but he was still quite alarmed by this. With his current physical constitution, it was not easy to grant him a noticeable increase in his blood essence power. Meanwhile, the major was already completely speechless. She was staring at Tang Wuling with a completely blank look in her eyes. He had bested a barn in close quarters combat, those mysterious golden soul rings and his freakish strength. Was this guy really a human being? Right at this moment, another dark green figure emerged from the central cave in a flash before hovering midair. Tang Wuling's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this. There really was no end to these things. However, he was feeling very confident. He had just been reciprocated by his golden dragon spear, which had instantly fully replenished his blood essence power and even taken it above its original peak. Compared to the barn, this dark green figure was clearly a lot smaller. It only appeared to be around 2 meters tall, so only slightly taller than a normal human. It had a pair of special wings on its back that resembled bat wings, but the bones within them were clearly a lot more massive. The connective tissue wasn't just normal skin, either, and those areas were covered in dark green scales. The creature possessed a figure that was very similar to that of a human woman, except everything was a lot more exaggerated. She had an extremely voluptuous chest and backside, but her waist was so thin that they were almost disproportionated to her backside. She had scorching green flames burning within her eyes, and the tips of her hands and feet were riddled with sharp spikes. Tang Wuling's eyes narrowed slightly. He couldn't sense any threat from this creature, but deep within his mind, there was a hint of indescribable fear that was originating from the deepest parts of his bloodline. Could it be that this humanoid creature was even more fearsome than the barn from before? The major's expression instantly changed drastically at the sight of this creature, and a horrified look appeared in her eyes. All of her astonishment from witnessing Tang Wuling's abilities had completely vanished, and it seemed that fear was the only thing in her heart. That's a demonic enchantress. Die, human. The demonic enchantress's voice sounded directly within the deepest part of Tang Wuling's soul. A rune of light emerged before her as her voice rang out, and immediately thereafter, Tang Wuling felt his entire body stiffen. His life force was fading at an alarming rate, and a dark green rune of light had suddenly appeared around him before rapidly seeping into his body. Was this a curse ability? On the Douluo continent, only evil soul masters were able to use soul skills of this nature, but this demonic enchantress clearly wasn't an evil soul master. Humph. Tang Wuling let loose a cold harumph as his bloodline vortex began to rotate in a frenzy. The most powerful unyielding will that originated from deep within his heart combined with his spiritual power before proliferating outward as a layer of golden light. At the same time, the rainbow gemstone on his wrist flashed, and a burst of powerful will erupted from his body. A muffled groan escaped from the demonic enchantress's mouth, and the green flames in her eyes jumped violently. In the next instant, Tang Wuling had shot forth like a speeding arrow with his golden dragon spear in his hand, forcibly struggling free of her curse before hurtling directly toward her. The demonic enchantress flapped her wings and pulled out a strange weapon seemingly out of thin air. The weapon resembled a bone, but also a war saber, and she descended from the sky before sending the weapon crashing down toward Tang Wuling. Boom. The two of them clashed, and Tang Wuling was forced back down onto the ground, but the demonic enchantress was also sent flying backward for several dozens of meters. A grim look immediately appeared on Tang Wuling's face. Despite his opponent's relatively small body, she possessed an extraordinary amount of strength. Most importantly, he knew nothing about this thing. In the instant that the demonic enchantress arrested her momentum, light flashed from her body, and she seemed to have flapped her wings as she appeared right before Tang Wuling in the next instant. Chapter 930. She was simply far too fast, hurtling toward Tang Wuling like lightning before bringing the strange blade in her hand directly down toward his shoulder. Even Tang Wuling was caught off guard by her speed, which was virtually as fast as instantaneous teleportation, and it was already too late for him to evade. Under these circumstances, Tang Wuling made a very direct decision. He didn't try to take any evasive measure, nor did he even attempt to defend himself. Instead, he reached out toward her chest with his left hand while lashing out with his right hand, unleashing his golden dragon annihilation claws. A long weapon like his golden dragon spear would only prove to be cumbersome in this situation, so he could only relinquish it for now, dropping toward the ground before catching it with his right foot. He was going to fight fire with fire. Tang Wuling was very confident in his own defensive and regenerative prowess, so he was retaliating in a very aggressive manner. The demonic enchantress gave a disdainful harumph, and her saber was slashing through the air so quickly that it was leaving a string of after images in its wake. Before Tang Wuling's hands reached her, it had already crashed heavily into his shoulder. Blood splattered everywhere, and Tang Wuling could feel that his left collarbone had been chopped in half by the devastating strike. However, his powerful physical constitution really shone through at times like this. Even though he couldn't use any soul skills, he still had the defensive abilities of his mountain dragon king torso bone, and in the instant that his collarbone and scapula were broken, he abruptly withdrew his bones to trap his opponent's weapon. A burst of energy that was filled with despair and destruction erupted from the saber. However, during his military training on the demonic island, Tang Wuling had attained destructive energy of an even higher level of purity than this, so he remained largely unaffected. His left hand wasn't able to grab onto his opponent, but he still managed to unleash his golden dragon annihilation claws. The demonic enchantress was clearly very confident in her own speed, but much to her surprise, Tang Wuling's claws encompassed an area with a radius of several tens of meters. 5 dark golden streaks of light flashed past, and the demonic enchantress had managed to retreat for over 20 meters, but she was still struck by the attack. In the instant before the attack landed, she abruptly withdrew her wings. Boom! Her body shot back like a cannonball for over 100 meters before crashing into a rock face in the distance. One of her wings had been severed by Tang Wuling's golden dragon annihilation claws, and he forced himself to ignore the agony spearing through his body from his shoulder as he flicked his right foot forward. His golden dragon spear was hurled through the air as a result, and it flew directly toward the demonic enchantress. He naturally couldn't squander this opportunity, and in the instant that he landed on the ground, he ran toward the major as quickly as he could. The demonic enchantress was simply far too fast, and he'd only be able to protect the major from nearby. Dark green light flashed as the demonic enchantress crashed into the rock face, and in the instant before the golden dragon spear reached her, she abruptly slid downward and landed on the ground to evade it. However, it was quite clear that she'd been severely wounded. Not only had she lost one of her wings, 5 deep gashes had also been inflicted onto her body. The flesh around the wounds was squirming violently in an attempt to heal, but the sharp intent from the golden dragon annihilation claws was tearing at her wounds in a frenzy. Streams of dark green liquid began to flow down her body, and as soon as the liquid dripped down onto the ground, it immediately permeated in all directions as dense dark green energy. Humans, your souls will be tortured within the abyss for all of eternity. The demonic enchantress's voice sounded within Tang Wuling's mind again. At this moment, Tang Wuling had returned to the major's side and also pulled out the saber that was protruding from his shoulder. He sealed off his bloodline to prevent excessive blood loss, and even though he'd already turned quite pale, there was no hint of pain etched on his face. He had always been extremely mentally strong. Golden light flashed, and the golden dragon spear returned to his hand. He took a deep breath to adjust his blood essence vortex, sending rich blood essence power surging toward the wound in the frenzy. He held his spear in his left hand and pushed his shoulder a few times with his right hand to ensure that the bones were correctly connected. The major was standing right behind him, and she could even hear the spine-tingling sound of his bones grinding against one another in his body. But Tang Wuling didn't even tremble in the slightest. He had to possess a will of steel. I should be ending this. The major patted her own body to search for something in a panicked manner. Right at this moment, the demonic enchantress in the distance suddenly sprang into action again. Her body swayed and split into 2 identical figures. Immediately thereafter, countless streams of dark green light poured out of the caves behind her in a frenzy before injecting themselves into her body. Her severed wing grew back, and her terrifying speed allowed her to reach Tang Wuling in virtually the blink of an eye. The 2 identical figures rushed toward him from either side, and the one on the left manifested another battle saber that she brought down toward Tang Wuling's body, while the one on the right abruptly stopped in midair. The rune from before appeared again, except on this occasion, it was targeting the major rather than Tang Wuling. The demonic enchantress was far too fast, and both its strength and curse abilities were also extremely staggering. In this dire situation, Tang Wuling didn't have time to think. All he could do was make a split-second decision. He paid no heed to the demonic enchantress on the left, and he almost instantly turned around before spreading open his arms and throwing them around the major's body. At the same time, a burst of golden light erupted from his body as he unleashed his golden dragon roar. The major felt an incredibly scorching burst of energy fluctuations surge toward her from Tang Wuling, and her body had completely stiffened in the face of the demonic enchantress's curse, but it had suddenly regained its mobility. Thud. The sound of blade piercing through flesh and bone rang out so close to her, but all she could feel was an overwhelming sense of security. Boom. The entire world spun around her, and the major only caught a brief glimpse of Tang Wuling sending both of the demonic enchantress clones flying with a sweep of his golden dragon spear. The roar of a golden dragon had erupted, but at the same time, she saw a shimmering golden arm fall onto the ground along with half a shoulder. She closed her eyes with all her might and pressed the button that she'd already fished out of her pocket. Their entire surroundings immediately warped and twisted, and the only sound that could be heard was a ferocious howl from the demonic enchantress. In the instant that they disappeared, 2 droplets of tears descended from above, only to be completely pulverized into water particles by another fearsome attack from the demonic enchantress. Tang Wuling's body shuddered violently, and he slowly opened his eyes. He was breathing rather heavily, and only after taking a few deep breaths did his breathing gradually slow down. He reflexively laid a hand on his left arm. Thankfully, it was still attached to his body in the real world, but the agony that he'd just experienced was still fresh in his mind. It had been far too realistic. He heaved a faint internal sigh. If he hadn't been protecting the major, he would have had a chance at securing victory. As long as he could use the golden dragon spear to puncture the demonic enchantress's body, there was a chance that he could have turned the tables. However, that demonic enchantress truly was extremely powerful. He didn't know how the Blood God Legion had managed to create such a fearsome creature for this trial. The glass cover was opened, and all of the equipment that was holding Tang Wuling's body in place were also withdrawn. He rotated his shoulder and did some stretching as he emerged from the glass cover. The major still hadn't awakened at this point, and through the glass cover, he could see that her brows were tightly furrowed as if she were experiencing some kind of immense pain. All of a sudden, her body shuddered violently before falling still again. Was she about to wake up? From the major's aura, Tang Wuling had managed to deduce that she seemed to be a 5-ring soul king. He didn't know what her background was, but she was already extremely outstanding to have reached such a high soul power rank in her mid-20s. It would be unfair to use Tang Wuling and the others as comparison as they were Shrek 7 monsters. They were supposed to be the very best among people of their age. Moments later, the major slowly opened her eyes, and it took a few more seconds for her eyes to regain focus, upon which she caught sight of Tang Wuling, who was appraising her from outside the glass cover. A complex look flashed through her eyes as she opened her glass cover and undid her bindings. However, after she stepped out of the glass cover, her legs suddenly gave out from under her, and Tang Wuling reflexively stepped forward to catch her. Tang Wuling hadn't noticed this in the heat of battle, but he could now clearly sense that this major's body temperature was a little high. However, she had an exceptional figure that was very supple, and it was quite clear that she regularly exercised and worked out. Thank you. The major blushed slightly as she struggled out of Tang Wuling's arms and stood up straight. Tang Wuling said, "So about my trial." The major faltered slightly before immediately recovering her usual cold facade. "You've passed. Come with me." She made her way out of this special testing facility as she spoke, and she was walking very quickly. At the very least, she was leaving this place far quicker than she'd come, and it was as if she were trying to escape from something. Thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Also leave a comment down below with suggestions on what novels to read.